everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today in one of our wonderful bioregional seminars. My name is Michelle Maloney, and I'm the co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. In a moment, I'll do an acknowledgement of country and a proper run-through of what we're going to be doing, but I really would like to introduce and thank Ian Lowe, who is kind enough to join us, and Ian will be giving us an introduction to perspectives of what Western law can tell us about nature's boundaries. But I'm going to share some slides to introduce to you the series itself and some of the wonderful webinar recordings we have available for you already, and let you know about our final webinar for this year. So today, yes, we're going to discuss Western science, bioregions and boundaries as a general topic, but Ian and I are both looking forward to a discussion about the potential and promise of what looking to nature as a guide can mean for human governance and human societies. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to why we're interested in bioregionalism, and then we'll hand over to Ian to give a talk about Western science and nature's boundaries. And then Ian and I will have a short chat, a yarn, about how human governance systems can be built on nature's systems and beyond. And then we'll open up for Q&A. So if you do have questions, please type them in the chat, and Sarah and myself will collect them as we go. So first, I'd like to acknowledge country. I live in a really beautiful part of the world, but I'm a bit biased. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play in the beautiful lands of the Kabi Kabi peoples. I'd like to acknowledge our elders past and present, the emerging young people and emerging leaders, and also acknowledge that all lands in Australia continue to be the lands of the different, many hundreds of Aboriginal peoples. Land was never ceded by treaty or in any other way. I'd also like to acknowledge that this beautiful photo was of the Glasshouse Mountains, something that I can see if I walk up the hill behind my house. And if you've ever been here, you'll know that it's a pretty remarkable landscape. And if you don't know the Dreamtime stories of Tibrogargan and his family that live in the landscape, please do look it up. I don't feel it's appropriate for me to share that story right now, but do have a look at it. One of the many things I love about Indigenous culture is the fact that the law is written into the land, and the stories connected to Tibrogargan and his family are extremely relevant today. So as always, it's a bit of a tradition. We'd like to invite anyone to pop into the chat where you are today, whose country you're on, and in the spirit of bioregionalism, if something has happened in your morning that's connected you to nature, that you've seen a plant or an animal, please do jot that in. Believe it or not, I read them all and I get very excited when I hear about different species that are being spotted. I myself would like to celebrate the return of the blue-banded bees. They went to sleep through the winter and they've been in the garden now for about 2 weeks. And I'm like a crazy mad woman plodding around there with my iPhone trying to take photos of them. They're very, very fast and difficult to photograph, but they're gorgeous. And before I give an overview of why we're interested in bioregionalism, I'd like to flag with you that we've just booked in the absolutely wonderful Dr. Mary Graham for our final webinar for the year on the 5th of December. Booking details will be available soon on our website, and if you're connected to us in Humanitics, you'll receive a notice. As you know, Mary Graham and I work together on a range of projects, and Mary's insights into the First Peoples governance systems, one of the most ancient systems of, for want of a better Western word, bioregionalism. So her insights are very valuable. For those who don't know about AELA, we're a small not-for-profit. We're about 10 years old. We spend our time working with others to increase the understanding and practical implementation of Earth-centered governance. And I will introduce the basics of governance in a moment because Ian and I will be chatting about it. Within our work, we focus on education and culture change, helping people who are interested in connecting with alternatives for governance systems and building a range of networks to do that work. And the reason that governance is something that we're a bit passionate about is governance is one of those cross-cutting issues that is relevant to everything we do. I often joke that if you Google the definition for governance, you will drown in a sea of literature and materials all around the world. We like to use the simple framing of the rules that we make to live, work and play together at every scale of human activity. And we're passionate about this because when you get to the roots of the governance system, you have the potential for significant systems change. And whether you're talking about laws or moral codes or social norms, um, laws within a society, the rules within an organization, at the end of the day, all governance is shaped by our culture, our values and beliefs. And in the work that AELA does, we're often drawing attention to the culture and values and beliefs that lie beneath systems in the West, like law and economics, that are built on extractivist modes. And what we're really interested in is how we can rethink those systems to be more regenerative. If you're new to even the idea of bioregionalism, I'll point you in a moment to the recordings from a couple of our webinars that will help give you more information about that. But in very simplistic terms, bioregionalism is a term from Western writers and activists that sees human societies and culture merely as part of nature and proposes that modern human societies can be more sustainable, successful, and meaningful if our human systems are organised within and connected to natural boundaries. We're interested in bioregionalism as a diverse array of ideas. We're not ideological, we're not locked into something being the right way. But the reason we think that connecting human beings to their local boundaries and local systems is not just because it's awesome and fun and it means you get to focus on the living world in your area, but it really does encourage and nurture deeper human nature connection and knowledge. Here in a colonial nation like Australia, one of the good things about the Western construct of bioregionalism is it can be a bridge for Westerners to connect with First Nations governance and a way to understand the very top layers of Indigenous governance systems. Obviously, their systems are ancient, complex, and deep, but they're often seen fundamentally as a form of ancient steady state bioregioning. And the other reason we're interested here within AELA is our sister organisation, the New Economy Network Australia. We're all passionate about localising economies and strengthening human beings' connections to each other, as well as the living world. So that's why we're interested in it. And as I said, we always pay respects to the First Peoples, but we are profoundly inspired by the governance systems of the First Peoples of this continent and other places. And so when we're looking, and this is a way of just introducing, but I know Ian will be able to shed much more light on this. So when we're looking across Australia, whether you're saying, oh, what do our 89 Western scientifically acknowledged bioregions need to be healthy? Or how do we live within healthy catchments? How do we care for rivers and waterways? Sometimes nature's boundaries are extremely powerful and very important. If you want to catch up on any of our recordings, Sam's talk was the last one we had in September, and he and a couple of his papers that he's written recently are an excellent introduction to the history and emerging ideas around bioregionalism. In August, we had a terrific chat with two incredible women, Eleanor and Anitra, about housing and what human habitats could look like and be like if we had a bioregional approach. And finally, our first speaker for this year was the absolutely incredible Shrishti Bajpai, works in India across a whole range of initiatives, and she gives some terrific insights into the work they're doing to connect human beings to country, or that's not a frame they would use in India, but human beings to their traditional lands and supporting their initiatives. So that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. But we do want to mention that Greenprints, which is a project that AELA created a number of years ago, is interested in ecological limits and sees the boundaries of nature as a very effective way to help human beings build governance systems that not only enrich our lives and support local economies, but actually facilitate us to understand and live within ecological limits. So that's my plug for Greenprints. So that's enough from me, and we'll come back obviously at the end for some chats. But I wanted to introduce the seminar series as a whole to put context around the wonderful talk that Ian's about to give. So Ian Lowe, how are you today? And thank you for joining us.
Well, I'm unmuted and fit as a flea, Michelle, and looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Well, let's get you sharing your slides and then I'll jump out of the way, and I can't wait to hear your talk.
Click share screen. Is my screen sharing?
Not yet, but we had a few technical issues, folks, so hopefully it'll work. I think it's a bit slow. Oh, something's happening. Yes, it worked. Life is good. Thank you, Ian.
I'll share from beginning.
Yes, over to you. And you might want to put it onto slideshow.
That's what I'm trying to do.
That's it. Very good. Thank you, Ian.
Okay. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live, the Kabi Kabi people. Pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. That's become a bit of a ritual, and even the politicians who outrageously campaigned against the modest proposal of a voice to Parliament these days remember to acknowledge the traditional owners. But it should be much more than a ritual, because the first Australians worked out over tens of thousands of years how to live sustainably on this harsh and unforgiving continent. And they embodied those knowings not just in custom and practice, not just in ceremony and song and dance, but in their system of laws. And their system of laws allowed them to live sustainably. And we really need to learn from that example, and we need to make proper reparations, recognising that the first Australians saw successive waves of illegals who arrived unannounced and unwelcomed, and proceeded not just to live in harmony with the first Australians, but acquire their land by a process that can only be described as robbery with violence. And if we hope to be a coherent society going forward, we really need to acknowledge our past and make proper reconciliation with the first Australians. So let me talk about the fact that in principle, we are committed to sustainable development. The Council of Australian Governments in 1992 adopted the National Strategy for Ecologically Sustainable Development. So in principle, all governments at all levels, Commonwealth, state and territory, local, coalition or Labor, are committed, and these are direct quotes, to development that does not reduce opportunities for future generations, to strive for equity within and between generations, to recognise the global dimensions of our actions, to protect our unique biodiversity, and to maintain the integrity of natural systems. I think it would take a very charitable observer to detect any sign that recent governments even know that there is a national strategy for ecologically sustainable development, let alone seeing that as the guardrails within which they make their day-to-day decisions. So, as Michelle said, bioregionalism is a philosophy recognising that political, cultural and economic systems would be more sustainable if they were organised around naturally defined areas called bioregions, defined by physical and environmental features such as watershed boundaries, terrain characteristics, soils, plants and animals. But it's important to recognise that a bioregion is also a cultural phenomenon, recognising local populations and local knowledge systems. Ecoregions are scientifically based with a focus on soils and plants and animal species, but bioregions are human regions informed by nature, but with a social and cultural element. I like the quote of political localism with an ecological foundation. The Planet Drum Foundation defined bioregion as a geographical area with coherent, interconnected plant and animal communities and other natural characteristics often defined by a watershed, plus the cultural values that humans have developed for living in harmony with these natural systems. Because it is a cultural idea, the description of a specific bioregion uses information from both the natural sciences and from other sources. So the bioregional perspective says that political boundaries should reflect ecological reality rather than being arbitrary lines drawn on a map. They should recognise the unique ecology of the particular bioregion. And so we should be encouraging consumption of local food, use of local materials, cultivation of local native plants. Fundamentally, we should be encouraging people wherever they live to live in harmony with their bioregion. As Michelle mentioned, the Australian government developed 30 years ago an interim biogeographic regionalisation of Australia, and the latest version, IBRA 7, classifies our landscapes into 89 bioregions, each based on common climate, geology, landform, native vegetation, and species information. examples are the Australian Alps, the Nullarbor Plain, the wet tropics. And those 89 bioregions are further divided into subregions, and the bioregions have been used as a planning framework for developing our national reserve system to try and ensure that all the important ecological communities are preserved through our protected areas. And as Michelle showed you, this is the map of the latest version of the biogeographic regionalisation, and you can see that the bioregions do not correspond in any way to the jurisdictional boundaries that we have arbitrarily drawn on the map, the lines dividing Queensland from the Northern Territory, or the Northern Territory from Western Australia. And there is at least a family resemblance to this map of what were the local government areas of the Indigenous Australians before the Europeans arrived. There is a limited local application of the notion. For example, I live at a conjunction of 3 biospheres declared under the UNESCO scheme of the Great Sandy Region, Noosa, and the Sunshine Coast. And the principle of the biospheres is that social and economic development should be constrained within the ecological limits of those areas. Noosa has a long history in this area because it was one of the 2 local government areas, Douglas Shire being the other one, that recognised 30 years ago that their main economic activity, tourism, relies on the integrity of natural areas, and decided, understandably, that they have an economic interest in protecting the integrity of natural systems, because that is what brings people to spend their tourist dollars in those areas. The attempts to maintain the integrity of bioregions in areas like Noosa are continually fighting pressures from state and Commonwealth governments with their naive focus on growth as the be-all and end-all. When I was preparing this, I Googled the term bioregional assessments, and I came across an extraordinary example of greenwashing. If you go to that website, bioregionalassessments.gov.au, you find this statement: the Australian government's bioregional assessment programs provide transparent scientific information to better understand the potential impacts of unconventional gas and coal mining developments on water and the environment. And it specifies there are 2 different programs: the Geological and Bioregional Assessment Program, which assesses impacts of shale and tight gas development on water and the environment, and the Bioregional Assessment Program, which is looking at the potential impacts of coal seam gas and large coal mining developments. And you'd have to say that people who are looking seriously at potential impacts of new coal mines, new coal seam gas developments, new shale developments, new tight gas development, simply don't get it, that we need to be developing in a way that maintains the integrity of natural systems, and new projects that accelerate climate change just do not fit at all into the notion of bioregional futures. The fundamental obstacles to a bioregional approach. The first is arbitrary lines drawn on the map by colonial officials in London, most of whom had never been east of Suez and had certainly never been to Australia, and divided the continent along arbitrary boundaries, which no recognition at all of ecological communities, no recognition of cultural or social traditions. So that, as I showed you, the map of Australia with the bioregions on it corresponds in no way at all to the arbitrary governance divisions. And historically, we've done what are ecologically silly things, like using the Murray River as the boundary between New South Wales and Victoria, and the Tweed River as the boundary between Queensland and New South Wales. And our current governance structure doesn't recognise cultural or social traditions. The fact that Broken Hill looks to Adelaide rather than Sydney, that Lismore looks to Brisbane rather than Sydney, that Albury looks to Melbourne rather than Sydney. And the more fundamental problem is the obsession with the economy as the be-all and end-all, and the pervading notion that protecting the environment is an optional extra as long as it doesn't interfere with economic growth. 30 years ago, I was at a seminar in Sydney about the sustainability of that city. And the then Premier of New South Wales put up this slide with a Venn diagram showing the environmental, the social, and the economic as domains of equal size and importance. And the text says sustainability is about living within our means, managing our consumption of resources, balancing environmental, economic, and social outcomes, improving the quality of life without degrading the natural environment. I was on the panel as the token ratbag, and I said that I thought the problem was that the implicit Venn diagram that most decision makers have is what I've called the pig-headed model, in which the economy is the main game, like the head of the pig, and society and environment are minor protuberances like the ears. And it's much easier to get politicians to respond to the degradation of the barrier reef if you tell them that it supports a tourist industry that employs 60,000 people or generates billions of dollars of income, than if you simply tell them that it's a unique natural system, remark which causes their eyes to glaze over. The problem with this approach, of course, is that markets give us a lot of things that we want, but the whole point of the advertising industry is to persuade us to buy things that we don't want. Clive Hamilton famously said that the purpose of advertising is to encourage us to use money we don't have to buy things we don't not want to impress people we don't like. And if you think about advertising, it very rarely gives you factual information about the goods or services that are being promoted. Richard Eckersley said that the 7 deadly sins, pride, lust, greed, envy, laziness, and so on, have been repackaged as the marketing imperatives of the modern world. And the marketing normally appeals to your pride or your greed or your laziness or your lust to encourage you to buy things you don't actually need. By contrast, natural systems give us the things that we absolutely need: breathable air, drinkable water, the capacity to produce our food, as well as things that are very important, like our sense of place. I look out the window and I see the frontal dune and the coral sea, and it's obvious that I'm living on the Sunshine Coast. I'm not in the red centre. I'm not in Tasmania. I'm not in the wet tropics. My sense of place comes from the natural systems. And of course, the spiritual refreshment I get from the natural areas is also very important. I remind people that if you look at the Earth from space, you can't actually see the economy. What you can see is the perilously thin membrane that supports life and the geographical boundaries which we've used to demark different polities, like oceans and mountain ranges. If we start from the view from space, you get what I think is the rational Venn diagram that reflects the bioregional approach. We recognise that the economy is a significant part of society, an important part of society, but there are things we expect from our society, like our culture, security, companionship, and love, that are not even in principle part of the economy, and a society is totally enclosed within and totally dependent on natural systems. We are just as dependent on natural systems as are gum trees or galahs or goannas or garfish. Like them, we get the things we need from natural systems, and we rely on natural systems to process our wastes. 30 years ago, I chaired the advisory group that produced the first independent national report on the state of the environment. And it said that we have a beautiful and unique environment, but we also have some serious environmental problems that need to be dealt with if we're to achieve our stated goal of ecological sustainability. And the problems, we said, aren't simple. They're the cumulative consequences of the growth and distribution of our population, our lifestyle choices, the technologies we use, and the demands they make on natural resources. We said the 5 big problems were loss of our unique biodiversity, pressures on the coastal zone, the state of our inland rivers, loss and degradation of productive rural land, and rapidly increasing greenhouse gas emissions. 5 subsequent reports have all identified the same problems with increasing urgency. We also recognised in that first report the limits on our knowledge. More than 1 million species are thought to live in Australia, but less than 15% have been formally described. And lack of knowledge about the diversity of life on this continent poses the most significant impediment to its conservation. We're almost certainly doing damage through ignorance rather than through conscious acts of malice. The latest SOE report said that overall the state and trend of our environment is poor and deteriorating because of increasing pressures from climate change, habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, and resource extraction. This quote, I think, sums it up. Our health, living standards, cultural and spiritual fulfillment, and connection to country are all interconnected and are all negatively impacted by our deteriorating environment. It is possible to change the system. I point to the example of New Zealand, which reorganised its local government in the 1980s, and it replaced the 850-odd local authorities with 11 regional councils and 67 territorial authorities. But most significantly, they drew the new boundaries so that they used the ridges as boundaries between regional councils rather than watercourses, which means that catchments are entirely enclosed within regions. Regional councils are then primarily responsible for environmental management in their region, including water supply, flood control, and so on. It makes sense as a bioregional approach to have a catchment as an integrated area of governance rather than having one regime on one side of a river, a different regime on the other. I couldn't find a way of rotating this, but I'm on the board of the Noosa Biosphere Reserve Foundation, and we're running an education campaign encouraging the people who live in Noosa and visit it to think of themselves as being in a living laboratory, recognising that our limited knowledge means we can never know with certainty what will be the results of changes. So every change we make is an experiment. So that if, for example, we replace shark nets with smart drum lines, we should make the change and observe the consequences. Almost inevitably, there will be consequences that we hoped for and ones that we didn't foresee. But the notion of a living laboratory is that we should be learning our way towards the sustainable future that we hope to have. A truly bioregional approach would dramatically improve our chance of ecologically sustainable development. That should not just be a forgotten national strategy, it should be an urgent priority, because at the moment we are systematically degrading our environment, systematically reducing opportunities for future generations. Let me remind you of those principles of bioregionalism. Political boundaries should reflect ecological reality. We should recognise the unique ecology of each bioregion and work within that. So we should be encouraging local foods, using local materials, living in harmony with the bioregion. Basically, as the slogan is on a poster carried by my little granddaughter at a recent school kids March for Climate, fundamentally, we should care for our world because there is no planet B. This Earth is the only home we have. It is the only home we will ever have. There's no realistic prospect of mass migration to another part of the cosmos or rescue by friendly aliens. We will be shaping the future of this planet, the future of each of our bioregions, and we have a duty to be using the natural resources sustainably, living within the limits of our bioregions.
Thank you so much, Ian. And if folks have any initial questions, please let me know. But otherwise, Ian and I are going to have a bit of a chat. We're going to dig a little deeper into some of these Western classifications of boundaries and such. So Ian, I think I told you this story once, that once upon a time I had the great accidental luck to meet a gentleman, oh, sorry, his name escapes me, Gethin. Gethin Morgan, who was one of the people back in the 70s and 80s who started the mapping process for IBRA 7. And I don't expect you to perhaps know him, but I wonder if we could talk for a moment about literally the reason for IBRA 7 existing and the different ways that Western science tries to identify boundaries within the living world. And I was just digging up some of my old slides when we used to talk. I was just wondering, and I don't mean to in any way put you on the spot, but there's all these different classifications that I personally have always found quite fascinating, but how they all fit together is definitely interesting to me. So I'll just quickly show them. So some of the big NGOs and other scientists have apparently mapped the ecoregions within 14 biomes across the planet. So hold that thought. And then within that, Australia has 8 of these ecoregions, these terrestrial ecoregions in Australia. And then we've got 89 bioregions and something, actually, it's just not quite there, the 419 sub-regions. And I have to say, to me, the sub-region map often really reminds me of exactly how Aboriginal people organise themselves. I find that amazing. But before we go into any of those sort of governance inspirations, can you speak for just a moment, Ian, to people like me who are not scientists, why are people classifying planet Earth like this? And what value does it have to those of us who are interested in connecting these ideas to governance? I completely understand why scientists seek knowledge. I'm the same, I love knowledge, but can you perhaps explain for those of us who are not scientists, why these regions mean things, how Western science sees these differences? And before you go into some of that, the one thing Gethin struck me with was an idea that the bioregions started from geology and plant species up, and catchments are obviously around waterways and all of that. So I just wonder if you could explain some of that to the non-scientists like me.
Well, the obvious point is that the wet tropical rainforests of North Queensland are similar to the wet tropical rainforests of the Amazon basin or the wet tropical rainforests of sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason is, of course, that they were once part of the same continent, which has gradually drifted apart over geological time. And so if we're interested in managing our wet tropics to maintain the integrity of those natural systems, we can learn from what's being done in the much larger areas of wet tropical rainforest in, for example, the Amazon basin. And we can also see the damage that is being done by inappropriate development there, try to learn from that and try not to repeat the damaging practices that have been going on in Brazil. Similarly, our grasslands have commonality with grasslands in other parts of the world. Our dry sclerophyll forests have commonality with those in South Africa and in Chile and Argentina. So we can learn from them. And there's probably, since we are the continent to which Western science has most recently come, which is why we've probably only identified 15% of the other species that are here. We have a great opportunity to learn from the more detailed understanding in areas where science has been going on for a longer time. And there are sort of common scientific principles that can guide our thinking generally. But fundamentally, we need to be thinking about the details of local species, local soils, local plants, local animals, because the species that now live here are the result of millions of years of Australia being separate from other continents and different paths of evolution.
Thank you, Ian. And someone else, I think Don has also commented, sorry, I lost it. There's a lot of comments coming through. The hierarchy of organising information also makes it a little easier to grapple with. And I agree. I quite enjoy looking at the ecoregions and the sub-regions and then breaking that down into catchments and sub-catchments. It's a it's a nice nerdy thing to look at. Whether it reflects deep reality or not, it's a nice framework to start with, isn't it? To help you get a picture of how it all fits together.
That's right. And if you understand what's happening to beaches in southeast Queensland, you also know what's going to happen to beaches in southern New South Wales or in Western Australia, that you can apply to other parts of the country, what you've learned by detailed science in one part.
Mm. And I remember when I was in discussion with Gethin Morgan, being as a person born in 1970, sort of being shocked that the IBRIS process hadn't started till the late 70s, early 80s. You know, I know on the one hand, Western science is criticized for being perhaps rigid or deductive, etc. But as someone from the Western tradition, you know, it's always sort of had this idea that people had classified environmental issues a little bit before my birth, but a lot of it was still happening in the 80s. So, and then he also pointed to, and I'll come to a question from that a number of people are asking, the political interest in these things. So my understanding, Ian, and is this correct, is that IBRA 7, which started as IBRA, earlier number, was to sort of help them identify the differences in landscapes and look at creating a national interconnected system of protected areas and national parks and reserves. That was one of the reasons for IBRA. Yeah.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the fundamental purpose of IBRA was to try and ensure that the system of protected areas contains all of the important, distinct ecological systems on this vast and diverse continent. And historically, there was no such scientific approach. I mean, basically what are national parks, or what were national parks when you and I were young, were basically areas that people didn't want for grazing or for broad-scale farming or for human settlements. So we can set that aside as a national park. And there was no thinking about how do we develop a system of protected areas that ensure that all of the distinct ecological systems are represented, and we don't continue to do damage that doesn't need to be done through ignorance.
Mm. Yeah, and this is a really interesting point that Mary Graham and other elders and I talk about a lot, the Western idea of this imaginary idea of separating everything out. Like we can protect this national park and then trash the joint over here in this river, or we can have this protected area, but we won't care about carbon emissions. This separation of caring for places. And of course, the Aboriginal map of Australia reflected that every place was sacred and that all things should be continuing to live while human beings live within that space. So as a Westerner dealing with a population, what are we up to now? Is there 8 billion of us on the planet now?
Correct.
We wonder how we can ever live in harmony with the living world like that. But at least we could certainly be trying a little harder to revert to looking at all places as special and important and worthy of life, not just your random national park. So
that's an important point, because historically, when we had relatively primitive technologies, we only did environmental damage in our immediate area. But we are now doing damage on a global scale. I mean, climate change is the obvious example, but before that, there was depletion of the ozone layer. We're creating ocean dead zones, that we can no longer pretend that the environmental damage we do is limited to our own backyard. By burning fossil fuels to produce electricity so that I can run a laptop computer and talk to you, I'm not doing any immediate damage to the frontal dune at Markula, but I'm contributing to changing the global climate, which is affecting Antarctica or affecting sub-Saharan Africa. So we really need to behave as if we intend to be permanent inhabitants of the planet rather than temporary visitors who only think about our immediate surroundings.
that's right. And that's what we talk about inside AELA is, you know, how can we live here forever? And sometimes you can see people in the Western culture just stop for a moment and actually try to grapple with that idea. If we have to stop the endless growth, and how do we just settle in a place and live here forever? We're not really geared to have those tools for about 1,000 years. The Eurocentric mind has not thought that way. It's always thought there's more out there. Let's go get it. So,
That's
Ian,
the point, because humans are not exempt from ecological laws. Our population cannot expand without limit in a closed system. And if we don't curb our numbers in ways that are socially acceptable, they'll be curbed by starvation and disease and fighting amongst ourselves. And I'd really like to think that my granddaughter will have a more civilized future than that.
Yes. Thank you, Ian. Going to go to some questions now, and I hope to get to everyone's questions. We'll see how we go for time. Just so you know, we had planned to wrap up around 1:20, 1:25. So we've got time. Vanda has, from the Koala Action Group, has said, I ask this question or similar question very often. How do we get our bureaucrats and decision makers to tackle the range of environmental issues we have differently? I've tried for 30 years and still waiting on a win. Other people have asked the same question. How do we get the political decision makers to actually focus on the environment as a core, centralized foundation of life?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I mean, if you look at our governance systems, generally the environment minister is seen as a lowly position. Most environment ministers are hoping that they'll be given a more important job in the future by not causing any disasters in their term of office. And that's really the fundamental issue. I think the assumption that as long as the economy is going gangbusters, then we can always clean up the mess that we're creating by economic growth. And the notion that as long as the gross domestic product is sufficiently gross, we can clean up the mess that we've made. And that's a fundamental misconception. But I don't know how you get around that, because the problem, the fundamental problem, is that people can see between now and the next election what's happening with their cost of living, what's happening with their wages, what's happening with the chances of getting a house. And they can't see what's happening with the climate. They can't see what's happening with the loss of species. And I think, as Barry Jones said, in politics, the urgent drives out the important, that our politicians are obsessed with what will get them re-elected. In the case of Queensland this coming Saturday, in the case of the Commonwealth by May next year. And as long as the environmental problems aren't going to lose them votes between now and the next election, they tend to be seen as a lesser priority. And I despair sometimes of trying to get our leaders to focus on what are the important issues rather than what are the short-term priorities.
Thanks, Ian. Just a reminder, folks, if you've got questions, please write them in the chat. Unfortunately, we can't cater for 90 people all asking questions and having a yarn. So thanks, everybody. I'm working my way through your questions. I'm actually going to read a comment from Lyndon. Hello, Lyndon. I know he's in New Zealand. He said, we did well with the bioregional approach, but the regional councils have in large part failed in their mandates for ecological sustainability. The usual suspects of powerful lobby groups and vested interests are the cause. Freshwater ecologist Mike Joy explains the issues well in his memoir, The Fight for Fresh Water. Lyndon, thank you for sharing that. I'll actually be looking that up because, as you know, we all look to each other, whoever's doing something interesting and important, and it's never great to know that they're not succeeding completely. But Ian, what are your thoughts? I mean, it sounds like the usual political barriers to actually doing even good structural change.
Oh, well, that's right. And unfortunately, as the old joke is, it's the golden rule. Those with the gold make the rules. That the affluent have more opportunity to influence the politics. I suppose all I can say is that if you have the right structural arrangements, there's at least a fighting chance. But if you use a watercourse as a boundary, you have absolutely no chance of integrated catchment management. If people in New South Wales are doing one thing and people in Victoria are doing something different. So, of course, it's not a panacea for all the problems, that still those who have influence will wield it. But if you get the governance structures right, you at least give the natural systems a fighting chance.
Thanks, Ian. And look, as a recovering lawyer and a governance nerd, someone profoundly interested in how human beings organize themselves, may I make some comments quickly? A lot of the time for the last 10 years within AELA, we've listened to communities in every pocket of Australia saying with great despair, the system is not working because it's not giving us a voice. And I often have to remind them that the system was never designed for participatory democracy or to give communities a voice. Just a quick reminder about how Australia is structured, because then in a moment, Ian and I are going to come in and answer some of these questions. We've got Johanna and Vander and a couple of others talking about Bryn, asking about, well, what bioregional structures or forms or governance can we change? That's the good stuff. Let's talk about that. But just a quick reminder, everyone. So the British invaded the continent, cast upon the place with its great horror show of destruction in many ways, drew very straight lines and defined new colonies, and each colony was equal to the other colony, and each colony was governed by the Home Office or the Colonial Office in Britain. And it wasn't until 1901, after many years of the founding fathers, and they all were founding old white men, had their conventions and discussions and thankfully decided they wanted a place that wasn't a place called Australia. But just remember, all of the colonies who became states have most of the power. They explicitly said, we will give up this much power to the federal government, and it became Section 51 in the Australian Constitution. So a couple of reminders. The environment does not appear in the Constitution, was never mentioned as the environment in colonial or state government constitutions. Resources as such, yes, different idea. Local councils are not in the Constitution. Local councils are merely the creation of state government. So state governments have most of the power around environmental or nature-based issues and also on how we organise local councils. Then the final thing before we get into, well, okay, that sounds a bit sad, but what can we do? There's so much we can do. The other thing to remember is representational or representative democracy is very limited. We vote for some person in some arbitrary electoral space every 3 or 4 years, and they're meant to go off and do things. And separate to the law, but deeply imbued in our political system of the two-party political system where everyone's saying the same thing because they're told to. So that's the system we have. It was never built for community support of nature. It was never built for localized control or decision making. But what we have to do is turn the whole system on its head and chip away at that. So, Ian, let's go to Bryn's question. Bryn's saying, you know, when can we change our local governments to be local government boundaries to be more like bioregional? And what's interesting is the whimsical nature of how state governments reformed local councils several years back for economic reasons. Let's talk about what could it look like if we had an amazing state government decide that it wanted to rearrange local councils based on bioregional or First Nations peoples' boundaries. How would they do that? It's not that hard, actually, is it?
It's not hard at all. I mean, the state government in Queensland decided to reorganise local government, and they told councils that they were being amalgamated. No correspondence will be entered into. They told Noosa Council that they were being amalgamated with Caloundra Council and Maroochy Council to form the Sunshine Coast Regional Council. The states have the power to decide what local government boundaries will be. And the problem is historically they've only thought about economic issues like ensuring that the local government is large enough to be able to manage the roads and manage the rubbish and manage the other local needs. They haven't thought about reorganising local government, so we'd be better able to live sustainably within the limits of bioregions. But a progressive state government could do that tomorrow. There is no legal obstacle, only the political obstacle that vested interests always resist change. And the people who are profiting from the current inappropriate system will die in the ditch to continue to profit from it.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's what's interesting for those who don't recall back, for example, and I know New South Wales made changes too, but when the state government did announce its changes on economic reasons, people marched in the streets. There was a huge civil society outpouring of disapproval, but they didn't listen and they didn't care. The flip side of that is if innovative leaders wanted to rearrange our boundaries, exactly as Ian said, it can be done. So let's keep that in mind, because change does happen. But we are dealing with what I often think of the Australian legal system as a very concretized, top-down legal system. But what's really powerful is when people just start to organize themselves at the grassroots and ground level anyway. And there's nothing stopping people from starting to experiment with localized participatory democracy to show how it's done. So the one thing I wanted to say before we get to some more questions is, one thing we must be doing in our society today is creating alternatives and running experiments the way Ian just mentioned. We can't just sit back and hope government will change when we ask them to. I don't think change will come predominantly that way. And I just want to flag that Mary Graham and the Yugambeh peoples in the Gold Coast are joining forces with a few others over the coming years, and Greenprints will be invited into that space too, to start to show what traditional governance looked like and how it can inform future equivalent of sub-regional governance. So there are good examples out there already being brewed up.
There are, and
Yeah.
I think that the two examples that I mentioned, Noosa and Douglas Shire, show that the community understands this. I don't think it's any coincidence that when the Queensland government reorganised the local councils, they forcibly amalgamated Noosa with the other two Sunshine Coast councils and Douglas Shire with Cairns. And I think they thought that that would knock on the head this anti-growth nonsense. But it backfired spectacularly, because when the new Sunshine Coast Council was first established, the mayor of Noosa ran for mayor of the new body against the mayor of Maroochy Shire, and Bob had a majority in every polling booth. That basically the electorate voted for applying the Noosa approach to the rest of the Sunshine Coast, rather than applying the approach of the rest of the Sunshine Coast to Noosa. And similarly, Cairns, with Douglas Shire included in it, elected a Green mayor. So where the community really want change and organise, change is possible even within the current system. But of course, it'd be much easier if we were working within a system where change could affect a bioregion rather than arbitrary lines drawn on the map by colonial bureaucrats.
No, excellent. Thank you, Ian. So just coming back, Johanna, and so I'm just trying to collate some of our questions together. So Bryn had asked the question about LGA boundaries, which I think we've given an indication could be changed. And Johanna has said, I'd love to hear more about possible management options changed by regional boundaries, for example, for the Murray River as it crosses current state boundaries. So again, it's that what could we do, Ian? But I mean, the poor old Murray-Darling has been subjected to terrible treatment.
Yeah, and it's a classic case, I think, that the Murray-Darling system has spans Queensland, New South Wales, the ACT, Victoria, and South Australia. And historically, each of those jurisdictions has fought to maximise what it gets out of the river system, rather than working together. And there's no doubt that the degradation of the Murray-Darling system is a direct result of Queensland building dams to stop water from the Condamine flowing into the Darling, New South Wales establishing cotton farms that are pumping water through shallow open channels in the desert where it's above 40 degrees and more water evaporates and actually gets to the crops. Victoria saying it will die in the ditch to protect the right to flood irrigate pasture for dairy cattle, and poor old South Australia fighting to do what it can with what's left after all of the other jurisdictions have had their share. And if we were serious about managing the Murray-Darling system, we would establish a Murray-Darling Basin Authority which would have total jurisdiction, which wouldn't be beholden to the state governments or the territory government of the ACT, and would be able to make decisions to manage the overall health of the river. But each of the state and territory governments would die in the ditch to prevent there being an overall systems approach. But fundamentally, unless there is an overall systems approach, the degradation of the Murray-Darling system will continue.
I'm just looking at these questions. Emma's come through with a terrific one, which I wanted to pipe up on anyway. So I'll read your question, Emma, and then we'll come back. So Emma said, the other question I have is that if we did align more with bioregions in our LGAs and governance mechanisms, what would we all need to ensure that the process didn't get co-opted by the system and itself become another colonial extractive process? Can I just say that I wrote a short paper about a year or two ago, which is neither here nor there, and Ian and I could probably talk about this for days, but if you hold as two slightly separate issues, number one, bioregional or natural boundaries for our governance, but the other one is the lack of underlying principles, ethics, or an end game for environmental care in this country. Environmental law is a patchwork quilt of things that were developed after the 1970s to respond to one problem after the other. What we don't have in Australia is, in a Western law from Western culture, is an underlying principle of caring for the earth. We don't have an underlying benchmark saying, this is what it looks like to be healthy here. We cannot change this. We must make decisions based on what is healthy. So, and if you turn the whole thing on its system, on its head, hey, Ian, we're asking all the wrong questions in environmental law and governance in the system we have. How can we have everything we want, damage what we want, and fix it up later or save a few pockets? The real question is, what does it look like to be healthy in this place, and how do we build our governance on that? Do you have comments on that?
Well, yes, I mean, it's the big question, and what I'm going to be talking about for an hour at the improbable time of 8 a.m. on New Year's Day at the Woodford Folk Festival. Some perverse programmer thinks that environmental law is a suitable topic for 8 a.m. on New Year's Day. But the fundamental point is that the environmental law has always been subsidiary. The presumption of the legal system is that economic development has priority, and an environmental law can only hold up a development if it's clear beyond any doubt that there will be catastrophic implications on the natural environment. And even then, it's the environment courts at the state level act as if the objectors, who are usually community groups with very limited resources, have to prove beyond reasonable doubt against developers with very deep pockets that the development is unacceptable. And we really have got it totally arse about, to use the Australian vernacular. I believe that those who want to implement a significant new project should have the burden of proof. They should have to show beyond reasonable doubt that the environmental impacts are acceptable. We should, and this goes to government at every level, that they should see it as their primary responsibility to maintain the integrity of the natural systems on which we depend, and to allow, as the National Strategy for Ecologically Sustainable Development says, to allow only those patterns of social and economic development that do not reduce opportunities for future generations. That's the fundamental point. And at the moment, that point is not embedded in environmental law. It's not embedded in the approach of government, state or territory or commonwealth. And as long as that is the case, we'll continue to be trying desperately to reduce the rate of degradation of the environment, rather than seeing restoration and enhancement, which really you and I would like to see, that a lot of the damage that's been done is potentially reversible. But at the moment, we're not even holding the line. Things are getting steadily worse. And every State of the Environment report at 5-year intervals has said, we have these 5 serious problems and they're getting worse. Stop me if you've heard this one. We've got these 5 serious problems and they're all getting worse. And my worry is that we will look back and see those reports as simply documenting in depressing detail the steady degradation of the life support systems on which we depend.
No, thank you, Ian. And so people who are interested in making change, please unlock your brain where you can and join with others to start building alternatives in your community through creative events, through festivals, through writing, through sharing, through practicing things like citizens' assemblies, bringing more and more different existing groups together to show what a positive governance model looks like. And the reason I always harp on about this is these are the things that are absent in government leadership, and these are the things absent in the current discourse with large businesses and others. Everyone's trying to maximize what they've got rather than rethink governance. And two papers that Mary Graham and I are working on right now, which will be out hopefully by early next year, are looking at connecting ecological custodianship with governance, but also with embedding certain aspects of our existing regulatory system, connect that to citizenship and obligations around bioregions. So, and I'm just putting in the link for anyone who wants to nerd out and read something that I wrote in the framing of an alternative judgment in a future scenario, which actually shows communities have the power to say, this is our ecological benchmark for health in this place. And exactly what Ian was saying, then corporations have to come along cap in hand and say, can we do this? And the community saying no. And that might sound like dreaming, but right now we've got the same legal system we've had for 230 years or 120 years, depending. So something has to change. All right. I'm a lot more chatty than I usually am when I host a webinar, and I normally say apology for that, but I'm having a fun time talking to Ian. So Ian, here is a big issue that I know that you are connected to, issues around population. Would you be comfortable answering Eileen's question, how can the Earth sustain 8+ billion people?
Well, with difficulty is the answer. It's not impossible if there is the political will. We now have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are an iteration of what started as the Millennium Development Goals. And the aim of the Sustainable Development Goals is that every human on Earth, however carelessly they chose their parents, would have adequate nutrition, clean drinking water, reasonable shelter, access to education, access to healthcare, and so on. 20 years ago, the UN Development Programme did a paper study. It said, imagine that we wanted to have a 10-year program to provide every human on Earth with the basics of the Sustainable Development Goals, so that everyone on Earth has clean drinking water, everyone on Earth has adequate nutrition, everyone on Earth has adequate shelter. And that would be a huge program, cost many trillions of dollars a year, which they then observed was about 5% of the global military budget. In other words, to ensure that everyone on Earth had the basics of a decent life would not require something as naive as peace breaking out universally. It would only require shaving a small amount off the obscene sums we spend preparing to fight each other over limited resources to ensure that we didn't have to fight each other because everyone had the basics. Now, a back of the envelope sum says that the whole world could live at the standard of material comfort that we did in Australia in about 1960. And I was a working adult in 1960. It wasn't a time of Neolithic privation. We weren't starving to death in mud huts. We weren't nearly as wasteful as we are today, but we had quite a civilized lifestyle. It is possible, but what it does require is reducing some of the obscene levels of consumption of billionaires, some of the obscene spending on thousands of nuclear weapons, which we know can't be used in a civilized world. It requires a reordering of political priorities around the principle of intending to be permanent inhabitants of the planet. But the fundamental point is that unless we provide all humans on Earth with a decent life, there will be continued conflict. Whatever there is orders of magnitude difference in material prosperity between Europe and Africa, between North America and Central and South America, between Australia and Southeast Asia, there will continue to be large numbers of people wanting to migrate to achieve what they see as material comfort. And I've argued for decades that we really should be investing seriously in aid, that most people want to have a comfortable life where they are. You have to be pretty desperate to get on a leaky boat and brave shark-infested waters to try and get from Indonesia to Australia. we should be trying to ensure that people in Indonesia are living comfortably where they are and not wanting to get onto leaky boats and brave shark-infested waters to try to come to Australia. And similarly, I think Europe should be investing in improving the quality of life in Africa. North America should be investing in Central and Southern America to try and ensure that wherever people live, they can live at a standard, at least of human dignity. Unless we do that, we will be in an increasingly conflicted and unstable world. And while it was acceptable perhaps 500 years ago for disputes to be settled by people waving weapons at each other, now that the weapons they are being waved are thermonuclear bombs, it's no longer acceptable to see violence as a way of resolving our differences.
Thanks, Ian. And there's a couple of questions from Oliver that relate to really what you might call rethinking demand management, degrowth, or actually a simpler lifestyle. And I'm going to come to that in a moment. But also Neil has got some questions about energy and energy consumption. So perhaps to get into the mode of talking about or connecting the population issue with consumption, Ian, I wonder if we could come back to population for a moment. I know that you've been an advocate for people in Australia and in other places thinking about population levels in our own communities. And we know that it's a very difficult conversation for some people. They feel it's an affront to talk about whether that might be immigration or birth rates. So let's hold that for a moment. I personally love clutching onto that IPAT equation, that IPAT, which was, I've forgotten now who, back in the day when I did my PhD on consumption. Thank you, of course, Ehrlich. So IPAT is impact equals population times affluence times technology, something like that. Yes. Anyway, it means that you have to talk about population and consumption often together. And so, Ian, and I'm going to read Oliver's comment because it's quite excellent. So he's got a challenge for the group. Hang on. My question or challenge to the group is, what does it feel like in your body when you close your eyes and consider this? In order to eventually live sustainably in our bioregions, especially with the current population densities, it probably means no more aeroplanes or long-distance fast travel, no more plastics, simpler industrial systems, fewer material goods, and learning to be in relationship with people, live with and hopefully appreciate the lives of other people, etc. And I would add living with a greater respect for and space for non-human organisms. So thank you for that important question, Oliver. And Neil's also asked, if we're looking at bioregional or other, how do we think about materials and energy consumption? And then all of this fits with population too, doesn't it? So for me, IPAT means the richer the country, you can address your consumption issues relatively quicker than some of your population. But what do you think, Ian? How does this all fit together?
Oh, well, you're entirely right. I reviewed a UN study called Resource Efficiency and Economic Outlook for the Asia-Pacific region, and it concluded that meeting the legitimate material expectations of the very large population in the Asia-Pacific region within the limits of the Earth's natural systems and within the limits of our resource base requires what they called a new industrial revolution, in which we meet human demands using somewhere between a quarter and a third of the resources per person that we now use. And I think that's a correct observation, and it should be our material expectation. Amory Lovins, the American energy analyst, famously said in 1975, people don't want energy, they want hot showers and cold beer. They want the services that energy provides. And much of the technology we use today is still embarrassingly inefficient. Just to quantify that in one local example, in the days of the Howard government, more than 20 years ago, a report was presented to the government called the National Framework for Energy Efficiency. And that looked at how we could reduce our emissions by using more efficient technology, more efficient refrigerators, more efficient washing machines, more efficient motor vehicles. They concluded that we could reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, which are changing the climate, by 30% just by switching to more efficient technology. and the criterion for whether it was economically acceptable was a payback time of less than 4 years. So it didn't require anything as fanciful as a dramatic new technology, which is much more efficient. Just using washing machines that are on sale in Western Europe but not on sale in Australia, removing from the Australian marketplace appliances that are so inefficient you could not sell them in Western Europe. I think the big challenge for the engineering profession and for our lawmakers is to lift the standard, to reduce the wastefulness of our current technology. If you think of an example like replacing incandescent light bulbs with light-emitting diodes, they use less than 5% of the electricity for the same amount of light. And nobody's standard of living has been worsened by taking away the old incandescent light bulbs and replacing them with LEDs. That's an example of the sort of thing we need to do. And I think our target as a civilization should be that new industrial revolution that the UN called for a decade ago, to ensure that we can meet the legitimate material expectations of people within the limited capacity of natural systems.
Thank you, Ian. So, both Neil and Oliver talked about material and energy flow, and Oliver also asked about the idea of degrowth. Certainly inside the New Economy Network Australia, or NENA, degrowth, a simple definition, is not a complete collapse of society, but a deliberate, concerted effort to manage and reduce the materials and consumption inside a particularly wealthy country. What do you think of degrowth as a strategy for reducing consumption? I mean, is it probably just as difficult as bioregionalism, or even harder, given it's got that naughty word degrowth in it?
Well, I mean, the problem is that most politicians think growth can go on forever. And I remind people that in the human body, if something grows without limit, we call it cancer, and we rush off to get it treated. Growth cannot go on forever. I'd commend a book called Managing Without Growth, written by Peter Victor from the University of York, Toronto. He looked at how Canada could be stabilised, and he looked at a model of stopping economic growth immediately, and the social impact was catastrophic. He looked at a model of continuing growth, and the environmental implications were catastrophic. The only future that looked acceptable was one in which first the population was stabilised and then the economy was stabilised, because he said if the economy is not growing but the population is, then resources per person are shrinking. But if the population is stable, then you don't need the economy to grow. And you can stabilise the economy, you can live comfortably, and you need other policies like sharing the work by limiting the working week, setting maximum incomes as well as minimum incomes, so that the money that's available is shared more equitably. That is a bit utopian, but I think if you're in a vehicle and it's heading for a precipice, it's sensible to start thinking about how you can slow the vehicle down and how you can steer it in a different direction, rather than like Thelma and Louise, looking forward to sailing off into space with the inevitable consequences. And at the moment, in ecological terms, we are booked on the Titanic and heading for the iceberg, and we really have a moral responsibility, both to be slowing the ship down and to be steering it away from the iceberg.
Yes. Thanks, Ian. All right, we're just starting to wrap up. I've got two quick questions, and then I'm going to finish with a question from JP, which also links to several other folks' comments and questions that we probably won't get to because they've just been coming in. A real quick one, Ian. Sushila and Deborah Ma have both mentioned something about the actual boundaries discussion we had. So, for example, Sushila has said, watersheds make sense. Have there been other traditional or in Western science units for different kinds of regions? And I'm not sure if that question came in before. I whipped up my eco-region, bioregion, sub-region. But did you want to talk about watersheds and maybe ecosystems or other systems?
Yes, I mean, watersheds is one obvious set of boundaries for a bioregion, but so are things like the Nullarbor Plain or the wet tropics. And the important thing is to look at what are coherent bioregions and develop a one-to-one correspondence between bioregions and our governance structures, rather than having arbitrary lines drawn on the map so that part of the wet tropics are in the Douglas Shire, part are in the Cassowary Shire, part are in the Greater Cape York Council, and so on. So, and the extreme example we talked about earlier is the Murray-Darling Basin, where you obviously need an integrated management of the system.
Thanks. And Deb's asked a similar question, but an excellent one, and I forgot to use this map. With bioregionalism on maps of land, do you also work in, or do oceans and seas have bioregional maps? Yes, they do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, did you want to speak to that, Ian?
Oh, I'm cosmically ignorant about oceans, but I know that there, just as there are on land, there are areas of oceans where the circulation patterns result in there being different fish species, different apex predators, and so on. And again, we have quite arbitrary systems that everything within 200 miles is part of Australia's regional boundary, and there are conflicts between Australia and Indonesia, between Australia and Timor-Leste, between Australia and PNG, and just as we need to think about integrated management on bioregions on land, we also need to think about how we interact with the oceans to respect all of those who depend on them. And a significant fraction of the world's population get their protein from the oceans, and the global fish catch has declined by about 20% in the last 25 years, so that we urgently need a more cooperative approach to managing the ocean resources in the same way as we do to look at what we're doing on land.
Thank you, Ian. And our little Greenprints website is terribly out of date. We've had a really, really busy year for a tiny NGO, but what I would like to be doing over the summer is updating our sets of maps and information resources. So Deb, do check in on the Greenprints website in about early December. I think you'll be able to see some of the up-to-date maps on different IBRAs and all of that. So terrific. Two last questions, Ian. You're doing so well that I've been grilling you for nearly 90 minutes. Another comment from Emma, which is really important, I think, and links to this other comment from JP. She says, also interested in exploring forms of transdisciplinary communities of practice in bioregions that can help advise and guide bioregional governance and such. And Sushila has said, me too. And Ian, if you've got any comments, please do go ahead. But what I'd like to say is, as of next year, the work that we'll be doing in Southeast Queensland, led by Indigenous thinking and followed keenly by the Greenprints team, is exactly about that. And if others want to share with us what you're up to, or if people have suggestions about where these communities of practice are, I think they're already there. They're often not calling themselves bioregional, but they're doing Noosa Biosphere or land care or all of the good stuff. But Ian, what would you say to that about building communities of practice around bioregional work?
Oh, the same. Was it Gandhi said, "Be the change you want to see in the world." That you can't complain about the situation unless you're working to improve things, and you can have alternative visions. I mean, you mentioned the Greenprints. 35 years ago, when the Green Independents had the balance of power in the Tasmanian House of Assembly, the Tasmanian government commissioned me to develop what they called an alternative development blueprint, and I called it Greenprint, which was looking at a pattern of economic development based on the principle of sustainably using natural resources, rather than the loot, rape, and pillage model of developing new mines to pay for the import of things we're not clever to make ourselves. And it showed that an economic approach based on sustainably using natural resources was actually just as good economically and much better socially than the approach we've traditionally taken. So I'm standing on my chair cheering your notion of Greenprints that we urgently need to develop in a way that can be continued for the foreseeable future, rather than continuing practices that we know are going to lead to tears before bedtime.
Thank you, Ian. And linked to that comment from Emma and our enthusiasm for building these communities of practice, I'm going to sort of finish with JP, but also mention Gil's comment. So JP has said, I love learning that the states can make change so easily. And from the civil society perspective, participatory democracy is already within our grasp. How might we shift the understandable overwhelm and apathy due to largely increasing economic pressures on people into peaceful bioregional activation? I have a gazillion ideas on that, and I'm sure everyone has their own ideas too. JP, I think the work that Nina is doing, and I know you're involved with that because I know the wonderful work we all do together. But also, Gil just mentioned citizens' assemblies, people's tribunals, tribunal.org.au will show you some amazing work that we all did, including Gil, who's on this call. We did a citizens' inquiry into the health of the Barker, which was a massive endeavour back in 2019. It's difficult for communities to do some of this work without a bit of funding support. So in terms of what would you do, what would be the call to action? I'll go first, then you, Ian. My call to action is if you have or already involved in local work, connect with others and try to build things like citizens' assemblies and other participatory democracy examples to show others what the community's up to and what's going on, and just keep connecting with others. Certainly Greenprints will be weaving together a whole sort of systems change approach to law, economics, governance, Indigenous leadership at the top end, and then what other systems could look like. Keep creating alternatives because the world is going to change and we need great ideas and good blueprints. That's what Greenprints is, a play on blueprints. And join your local groups, join with each other, join Nina, get involved. Yeah. Ian, what would you say?
Obviously do what you can in your local area and take heart from the sort of changes that have happened in the last decade. It started with Kathy McGowan in Indi, but then Zali Steggall in Warringah. Electorates that have been held by one political party since the Crimean War have elected independents with a commitment to representing the local community and getting more action on climate change and greater integrity in government. When enough people want change badly enough, change happens. So don't be depressed. Look at those examples of how electorates like Warringah and Kooyong have elected feisty independents who are really making a difference. So get out there and change the world.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. The call really is to keep doing the things that are important to you or that you love or that you're good at. Sometimes they're not all the same thing because it is a fractal approach. Everyone has to do the things to blend together. And if you're interested in nerding out on bioregionalism, governance, law reform from the bottom up, do get in touch with us. We're teeny, but we like working with others. So look, thank you. Let's show in a daggy way our online support for Ian, whether you would, yes, press your button for clapping or do what I do, which is an air clap, which I think is very elegant. Ian Lowe, you're awesome. Thank you so much for your time and for being with us, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
You have a great day too, Michelle. Thank you for your contributions, as ever.
Thanks, love. See you soon. Bye.